Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into something significant, the current economic and political picture in the UK.
Yeah, it's based on a source you, our listener, flagged for us a discussion with Steve Baker, James Van Straten, and Peter McCormack.
Exactly. And it's quite a discussion. Our mission here is pretty simple. Pull out the key takeaways, understand what they mean for you, but, without making it overly complex.
We're working from excerpts of their YouTube chat, the transcript, so it's direct insight.
Okay, let's jump right in. It seems to start with a pretty stark warning from Steve Baker about the UK's finances.
Oh, absolutely. Blunt is the word. He basically says the country's heading towards bankruptcy. And importantly, it's not just the national debt we always hear about.
Right, so what else is there? He mentioned some really big figures, doesn't he?
He does. He talks about 2.8 trillion pounds in unfunded public sector pension promises.
Okay, 2.8 trillion.
And then another 5.6 trillion for state pensions. These are massive hidden liabilities.
Hidden liabilities. And he thinks this could, quadruple the national debt?
That's the potential impact he flags, yeah. Which is, frankly, staggering.
So what does that actually mean for you listening? For us?
Well, the implication is pretty direct. These massive sort of off-balance sheet debts suggest that either significant tax hikes or substantial cuts to public services are almost unavoidable down the line.
We're talking things like pensions, healthcare, social care.
Exactly. And Baker's point is this isn't some abstract future problem. He's talking about needing to make hard choices now or facing a potential default on the welfare state within, say, 10 to 20 years.
Wow. 10 to 20 years. That's really quite soon in political terms, isn't it?
It is. It brings it into sharp focus. It's not kicking the can decades down the road.
So a very real challenge. And the discussion then seems to broaden out a bit beyond just the numbers.
It does. They start questioning not just economic policy, but the fundamental role of government and the whole monetary system we operate under.
And there's a sense of disappointment.
Yeah, definitely. A shared feeling among them that government performance, both here and internationally, is lacking. Baker even references speeches he gave years ago questioning the big monetary order experiment, as he calls it.
Right, so this isn't a new concern for him. And this idea that we're questioning the role of government itself, that feels quite profound.
It is. The suggestion is we're moving beyond just tweaking policies. There's this undercurrent, this worry that easy money and too much government is corrosive.
Okay, easy money. Let's unpack that phrase a bit. What exactly are they referring to there?
Generally, it means things like keeping interest rates extremely low for long periods and central banks creating new money, electronically quantitative easing, or QE to buy assets. Basically, making borrowing cheap and increasing the money supply.
Right. And the worry is that this distorts things, leads to problems.
Yeah, that it encourages potentially bad investments, fuels asset bubbles, like in housing perhaps, and just generally isn't sustainable.
Okay, that makes sense. And they link this economic picture to something quite alarming politically, don't they?
Yeah.
About young people and democracy.
They do. They mention polling data showing younger generations questioning democracy, maybe even favoring a strongman type leader.
Which is deeply concerning.
It really is. The argument being made is that this economic instability, this feeling that the system isn't working for them, could be eroding faith in democratic institutions themselves.
So faced with this rather bleak picture, what solutions do they start to sketch out?
The core theme seems to be a return to what they call honest money. We'll get more into what that means, and also focusing on fixing the underlying institutions. It kind of sets the scene for their critique of modern money.
And a big part of that critique is this easy money concept. Baker apparently warned about this back in 2014.
Yeah, he mentioned a speech where he specifically flagged concerns about cheap credit, possibly creating housing bubbles. So he's been thinking about these risks for, quite a while.
And he puts it in a historical context, too, about governments always wanting to spend more.
He does. His point is that governments throughout history have always tried to fund their ambitions, wars, back then, now maybe welfare, health, education, beyond what the public is really willing to pay through direct taxes.
Which leads them to find other ways, borrowing or these easy money policies.
Exactly. It's a recurring pattern, he suggests. And his conviction seems quite strong that the current monetary order, the way things work now, won't really change until its flaws are, as he puts it, tested to destruction.
Tested to destruction. That's a pretty dramatic phrase.
It is. It implies a belief that things might have to get significantly worse before there's the political will for fundamental change.
Okay. Now, the conversation takes a turn towards something I know interests a lot of people listening, Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And Steve Baker's view seems surprisingly positive.
It does, yeah. What's interesting is he doesn't just see it as an investment. He views it as a practical working example of peer-to-peer, non-state money.
And he actually used it.
Yeah, he shares this anecdote about buying a camera accessory with Bitcoin and finding it, easier than using his credit card for that particular transaction.
Huh. A real-world use case from a member of parliament. That's quite something. So where does this positive view lead him in terms of policy ideas?
Well, he talks about removing obstacles to alternative currencies developing. Specifically, he suggests treating things like Bitcoin more like gold is currently treated, so maybe exempting them from VAT and capital gains tax.
Right, leveling the playing field, in a sense.
Kind of. And he even floats the idea of allowing people to pay their taxes using these new forms of money.
Wow, that would be a massive shift.
Yeah.
So he really sees Bitcoin as proof that we can move away from relying solely on state-controlled money.
That seems to be his point. He sees it demonstrating a possibility. He connects it back to this ongoing, unprecedented global experiment in monetary policy and debt, suggesting we might be heading towards a new global system eventually.
It ties back to that speech he apparently gave 11 years ago, advocating for free enterprise to challenge the status quo in money.
Exactly. It shows a consistency in his thinking over a long period.
And James Van Straten chips in with a quick Bitcoin story, too.
Yeah, just a brief one about buying some Bitcoin early on and then selling it. Perhaps, like many people, not quite realizing its potential back then. A relatable story for early adopters, I suspect.
Definitely. Okay, so if these issues are so fundamental, so critical, the obvious question is, why aren't more politicians really grappling with them, getting traction?
That's a really key point they discuss. Exactly. And there's also the frank admission that maybe many MPs themselves don't fully grasp the intricacies of monetary policy or Austrian economics.
So it's a mix of time pressure, political incentives, and maybe a knowledge gap, too. It sounds like a systemic problem.
That's the impression, yeah. Which leads them to reflect on past crises. James Van Straten shares his experience around the dot-com bust.
Right. He left the military for the tech boom.
He did, left the RAF, joined the dot-com world, and then saw it all collapse.
Hmm?
And it made him wonder, why did everyone make the same mistake at the same time?
And that led him down a particular intellectual path.
It seems so. He mentions reading Ludwig von Mises, who's a central figure in Austrian economics.
Which emphasizes free markets and warns against government intervention, especially in money and credit.
Precisely. And from that perspective, he felt the 2008 global financial crisis wasn't a surprise, but rather a predictable consequence of, again, cheap credit and distorted signals in the economy.
Interesting how that personal experience shaped his economic view. They then draw a parallel, don't they, between the early internet and Bitcoin now.
Yeah, it's a common comparison. They mention Bill Gates initially dismissing the internet's potential. The idea is that truly disruptive technologies are often misunderstood or underestimated at first.
But they also point out a key difference in adoption.
They do. The internet, once you got it, offered immediate, tangible benefits, email, information access. The friction to adoption was maybe technical at first, but the value proposition was clear.
Whereas
Bitcoin involves financial risk, requires understanding complex ideas, and faces, let's be honest, a lot of negative propaganda and regulatory uncertainty. The path to adoption is just harder, even if, as they suggest, everyone needs it but doesn't realize it yet.
Everyone needs it. That's a bold claim. This ties into another major theme, the generational divide, the economic reality for young people today.
Yes, this comes across really strongly. They talk about the immense challenges younger generations face. Affording housing is the big one, but also related things like delaying marriage, having kids later.
Because the basic building blocks like owning a home feel out of reach.
Exactly. High house prices are seen as this massive impediment to young people taking on responsibility and building stable lives in the way previous generations perhaps took for granted.
Baker reflects on this himself, doesn't he? How much harder it's become since he was first elected.
He does. He notes how even someone on a decent salary now struggles to get on the housing ladder in many areas, which just wasn't the case to the same extent 10 or 15 years ago.
And they contrast it with their parents' generation.
Yeah, remembering a time when often one income could support a family and cover a mortgage. They link this economic pressure, the need for both partners to work, often long hours, to the potential fragmentation of the traditional family unit.
And there's a stark statistic mentioned.
House prices doubling in 20 years, while wages absolutely have not kept pace. That really crystallizes the problem.
Definitely. And they directly link rising house prices to the amount of money in the economy.
Yes, they point to the period between roughly 1997 and 2010 when the UK money supply tripled. And over that same period, house prices soared, especially the closer you got to London.
Suggesting a causal link.
No.
More money chasing the same assets pushes up prices.
That's the implication from their perspective, yes. That monetary expansion feeds asset price inflation.
Which brings us back to the importance of looking at things in real terms, adjusted for inflation, something they feel isn't done enough.
Exactly. Nominal figures can be really misleading if the value of money itself is eroding. James shares a personal story here, doesn't he?
About using a house deposit for Bitcoin during COVID.
Right. Anticipating inflation and rising rates would hit the property market while believing Bitcoin offered better protection. They also touch on the rising running costs of homeownership renovations. Energy bills just keep going up.
And that interesting perspective, pricing housing in Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's a provocative framing. They suggest if you measure house prices in Bitcoin terms, property looks like it's been clubbed, meaning Bitcoin has vastly outperformed it as a store of value recently. They also note the Bank of England isn't exactly a fan of Bitcoin.
No surprise there. This then leads them back to government effectiveness, or lack thereof, and political incentives.
Yes, there's a pretty strong critique about, quote, massive amount of incompetence and lack of understanding of economics within government.
Strong words.
Very. And they question the incentives. In politics, the main test is getting elected, right? That doesn't always align with making tough, long-term, economically sound decisions.
And they float the idea of paying top politicians more.
It's mentioned as a way to potentially attract different kinds of talent, although they admit it's controversial and not the whole picture.
Yeah.
They do clarify MPs don't set their own pay. It's done independently, which many people don't realize.
But the core issue remains. This disconnect between average earnings and the soaring cost of essentials, housing, energy, water, food.
Absolutely. And they feel these fundamental cost of living drivers aren't being seriously questioned or addressed by politicians. It goes beyond just blaming Brexit, for instance.
Is it incompetence, or is it, as they touch on, this idea of managed decline?
They discuss that phrase, managed decline. Is it intentional? Probably not deliberately is the sense, more likely incompetence or inertia. But they do see an opening for change because of the widespread dissatisfaction.
Pointing to things like Trump or the rise of Reform UK?
Yes, examples of alternative messages gaining ground, because the main parties are perceived as offering more of the same. Though they are quick to point out that Reform's initial manifesto, for example, wasn't seen as fiscally credible.
Which leads to this call for more honesty from politicians, doesn't it, about the real financial situation?
Yeah, a real need for someone to just level with the country about the hard choices required. They discuss the ideological difficulties, say, a labor government might have in implementing radical fixes that involve shrinking the state.
Suggesting labor might struggle, and that could create an opening for someone else.
Possibly. That's floated. They talk about the challenges for figures like Kemi Badenoch or Nigel Farage to really cut through. Feedback mentions suggests Badenoch maybe hasn't been radical enough, and Farage might lack the policy depth.
And the constant pressure on any leader from MPs worried about their own seats makes radical change very hard.
Very hard. That's a recurring point, the tyranny of the electoral cycle.
James offers a specific view on younger generations in politics here.
Right. He does. His take is that many young people are just fundamentally disengaged from traditional politics altogether. They're focusing on sorting their own lives out, improving themselves, rather than looking to Westminster.
But for those who are engaged, what's the focus?
For the economically aware ones, it's monetary policy. The Bank of England's actions. That's where they see the real power and the source of many problems.
Speaking of the Bank of England, they discuss a recent action, this new repo facility. What's that about?
Right. This is a mechanism the bank set up to provide emergency liquidity, basically short-term cash loans, to institutions holding UK government bonds, or gilts. It was mainly to support pension funds and insurers who got into trouble when gilt prices fell sharply.
And some see this as problematic.
Yes, described by some critics in the discussion as akin to Ponzi scheme money printing, essentially creating money to prop up the value of government debt. It signals fragility, they argue.
And they link this to the gold price.
Yeah, the fact gold is hitting all-time highs is seen as a signal, a loss of faith in fiat currencies, perhaps. There's also skepticism voiced about official figures regarding how much gold is actually physically held in London. James clearly positions himself as a money reformer.
Advocating for the denationalization of money, essentially, getting the state out of it.
That's the idea, yes.
They also look at what the gilt yields themselves are telling us. Can you explain that briefly?
Sure. The yield is the return an investor gets for holding a government bond. If yields go up, it means investors are demanding higher interest to lend the government money, often because they see more risk or expect higher inflation.
And what are the yields saying now?
They focus on the 30-year yield. The point made is that even at around 5% nominal yield, that doesn't really compensate you for inflation, and the rate the money supply has been growing, it's a negative real return.
And they mention the Liz Truss period again.
Yes, how yields shot up violently after her mini-budget, causing that LDI crisis for pension funds. The fact that long-term yields remain elevated, even as central banks talk about cutting short-term rates, suggests the market is skeptical about the UK's long-term economic health.
To the point of comparing the UK to an emerging market.
That comparison is made, yes, suggesting the market views UK debt as carrying more risk than it perhaps used to.
So going back to Liz Truss, the standard narrative is she crashed the economy. What's Baker's take?
His view is different. He argues Truss correctly identified the deep-seated problems, low growth, high taxes, and was trying to fix them.
So what went wrong, in his view?
Several factors. The bond market was already fragile post-COVID. The complex LDI positions and pension funds were a vulnerability. Then there was the sheer scale of the energy bailout trust, announced ironically, a huge state intervention. And also her communication style and how she handled the institutions, the civil service. Maybe a more collaborative approach would have worked better.
Interesting perspective. What about the current shadow chancellor, Rachel Reeves? Do they think she has much room to maneuver if Labour wins?
They acknowledge the constraints. Any incoming government inherits existing spending plans, treasury inertia. Raising money via taxes or borrowing is always the core challenge.
And getting public buy-in for genuinely radical change is tough.
Extremely tough. Because fundamentally, people often want contradictory things, lower taxes and higher spending. They mentioned Bastiat's famous quote about the state being the great fiction through which everyone tries to live at everyone else's expense.
That's a classic. And they see Reform UK tapping into this desire for lower taxes.
Yes, Reform's appeal is seen as offering that superficially attractive package, lower tax, lower spending. But Baker is critical, calling it populism that doesn't offer real solutions for finding the welfare state and could lead to ruin. Realistic choices are needed, he argues.
It circles back to needing politicians willing to be honest, even if it's unpopular.
And the observation is made that often the politicians gaining traction are the ones critical of the status quo, like Reagan was about the size of government. The challenge is making sound policy politically appealing.
There's also this idea about authenticity being really valued now.
Yeah, in a world of social media and spin, people seem to crave leaders who feel real, who speak plainly. They cite examples from music like Oliver Anthony or podcast appearances by figures like Trump, suggesting an appeal and seeming normal.
A breakdown of trust in polished institutions.
That seems to be the feeling, yes.
And this dissatisfaction is leading some to talk about revolution.
Well, maybe not literal revolution, but a sense among some that we're on the cusp of a major shift. Public anger over wasted taxes, a feeling the system is broken. They mention the fourth turning theory, the idea history moves in cycles, and we're in a crisis era now.
And younger generations feel particularly stuck.
Yeah, frustration with an antiquated and slow system that doesn't seem to serve their needs.
Generational views on things like retirement also differ starkly.
Absolutely. If you're older and financially secure, your view is different from someone younger worried their savings could be wiped out by inflation or government action, citing examples like Venezuela. They also touch on the supposed characteristics of this fourth turning group focus, shame, political reset.
And that sense of shame links to the procurement files scandal they discuss.
Exactly. Real anger and embarrassment about revelations of wasteful government spending. How could this happen, especially under a supposedly conservative government?
Is it just incompetence? Or lack of oversight?
It's complex. MPs are often distant from specific procurement deals. But the example cited Porsches for Albanian prisons. Odd research grants, they just look bad and suggest a lack of basic accountability. It undermines trust.
The contrast with how a business would manage its finances is stark.
Yeah, the analogy used is running a football club. You'd have rigorous monthly budget reviews, accountability for every pound. Government seems to lack that granular oversight.
Because the numbers are just so huge, maybe. £35,000 seems like nothing in a multi-billion budget.
That could be part of it. Plus, the lack of clear personal accountability in the short election cycle is discouraging long-term thinking.
And the media's role in this.
They criticize the mainstream media for sometimes failing to dig into this waste effectively. They praise independent outlets, podcasts, journalists like Charlotte Gill for bringing things like the procurement files to light.
But politicians respond to immediate voter concerns, not necessarily these deep systemic issues.
Often, yes. And bureaucracy itself can obscure responsibility, the hideous truth, as one might put it.
So instead of manifestos, they want a business plan.
Kind of, yeah. A clear budget and plan presented before an election, not just promises. They even argue manifestos released late can be a bit of a fraud, forcing candidates to back things they haven't properly scrutinized.
Suggesting leaders should campaign on honesty about hard choices and a plan for genuine growth.
That's the ideal, yes. Winning leadership on that basis.
But where does growth come from? That's the big question.
Exactly. After years of easy money and not much growth to show for it, where's the engine? They suggest maybe entrepreneurial activity based on sound money, but then immediately worry about the tax burden on those entrepreneurs.
And broken promises on tax hikes don't help build confidence.
Not at all. Both main parties have broken tax pledges.
James provides a very concrete example of the burden on small business, doesn't he, with the cafe?
He does. A really detailed breakdown. Business rates costing nearly £18,000 a year before you even open. Then VAT taking 20% off the top of sales.
Plus national insurance, other costs.
Right. The cumulative effect makes it incredibly tough for small retail businesses, especially in struggling town centers. He suggests maybe scrapping business rates entirely for local high street shops.
That would be radical. High energy costs are also framed as a tax, effectively.
Yeah, the UK having some of the highest energy prices in Europe acts like another tax, they argue. And government policies, particularly around net zero, are implicated as a contributing factor.
James mentions challenging Ed Miliband on this.
Yes, suggesting using wasted wind energy for Bitcoin mining, presenting data, but apparently being dismissed.
And they criticize Labor's entrepreneurial state idea.
Yeah, the argument being the state isn't really an entrepreneur, and trying to act like one leads to misallocating resources. Let the market figure it out, is the underlying view.
But implementing change is hard because of vested interests.
Very hard. People benefiting from subsidies, complex contracts few understand. MPs often get imperfect briefings, making good decisions difficult.
Which leads back to that individual response. Buy Bitcoin, opt out.
It's presented as one potential path, taking personal responsibility, using an asset outside the traditional system. James shares his own strategy, prioritizing Bitcoin over property.
And they note the UK's obsession with property compared to Europe.
Yes, and contrast it with the poor real terms performance of the FTSE 100 since 2008. Traditional UK assets haven't preserved wealth well against inflation. Property is seen almost as a form of capital control by some.
And anecdotally, younger people are more drawn to Bitcoin.
They suggest so based on conversations with students. More interest in Bitcoin than stocks or bonds. They share a story of someone skipping uni, working, investing in Bitcoin, and being financially ahead.
Raising questions about the value of some degrees versus practical skills and savvy investing.
Exactly. Especially with so much educational content available online for free.
So where does the hope lie, ultimately?
In people becoming informed, they argue, creating a terrain of debate through things like podcasts, think tanks, shifting the national conversation so people demand better from politicians.
Despite the challenges media influence, low-caliber politicians, people's resistance to changing their minds.
Yes, acknowledging all those hurdles, groupthink is powerful. Resistance to Bitcoin persists even as understanding grows.
But there's still this underlying feeling we're in a fundamentally different time.
A strong sense of that, yes. Driven by technology, maybe not fully grasped yet. A weird mix of huge credit expansion and potential deflation from AI and tech. Political systems are struggling to cope.
Could it lead to an age of libertarianism? Less state needed.
Baker floats that idea, but admits selling libertarianism, less government, fewer freebies is politically tough. And the disconnect with democracy, low turnout, is a worry. He even says he'd have run for leader if re-elected, lacking faith in others.
Wow. They also touch on wealth disparity.
Yeah, data showing the biggest gap since 1929. The argument is the state constantly backstopping the economy inflates assets, helping the already wealthy.
But even in high inflation places, people survive.
Yes, referencing Argentina, Venezuela, life finds a way, but it's incredibly tough, which underscores the need for really high-quality political leadership. Baker mentions Kemi Badenoch would need to be really good.
highlighting again that lack of political courage.
Yes. Frustration with the lack of politicians willing to make genuinely hard choices, preferring easier populist routes.
And finally, they look briefly at Bitcoin policy specifically in the UK.
Yeah, wondering what comes next. Noting U.S. moves on stablecoins, their importance in the treasury market, but also the ongoing friction in the UK banks closing accounts.
And that mystery stash of Bitcoin the UK government supposedly holds.
The 61,000 Bitcoin, yeah. What's the plan? A strategic reserve, nobody knows.
So wrapping it all up, the consensus is things can't really continue as they are?
Pretty much. A feeling of unsustainability, a need for significant change, and the crucial importance of open debate and critical thinking to find a way forward.
Okay, so to just quickly recap this deep dive, we've touched on the really precarious state of UK finances, those hidden debts.
The trillions in pensions.
Right, and the wider questioning of government, of the monetary system itself, then the potential role of Bitcoin as maybe an alternative.
A non-state option, yeah. And the generational divides, the housing crisis.
Huge issues for young people, and ultimately this crying need for, well, honest and competent leadership. We heard some surprising perspectives, didn't we? Baker's view on Bitcoin, the sheer scale of those liabilities.
Definitely some aha moments, or maybe oh dear moments.
Indeed. And none of this is abstract, is it? It affects you listening, your savings, public services, your future, your kids' future.
Absolutely. Which brings us to a final thought, really, for you to ponder. Given everything we've talked about, the finances, the politics, the potential solutions, what single action do you think would make the biggest positive difference to the UK's future?
Something to chew on. A huge thank you to our listener for pointing us towards this source material. It's vital we keep exploring these topics and having these conversations.